to convict or not convict, and the reliability of Ohio's COVID data. Joining us on Columbus on the Record this week, Jackie Borchert, Ohio Bureau Chief for the USA Today Network, Derek Clay, Democratic strategist, and Mark Weaver, Republican strategist. After a week of dramatic testimony, all eyes are on Republican senators like Rob Portman to see if they will stick by Donald Trump or convict him in the impeachment trial. Democrats laid out their case with video evidence claiming the former president's false claims of a stolen election fueled the deadly riot at the Capitol. The president's defenders claim Trump's rhetoric is protected by the First Amendment, and convicting a president after he leaves office is unconstitutional. Conviction is still thought to be unlikely, but not impossible, and so-called reasonable Republicans like Rob Portman are Democrats' only hope of punishing the former president. Derek Clay, the president's lawyers, wrapped up their case on Friday afternoon. They were saying that Democrats also have been urging their supporters to fight like President Trump has, so that was their case. How optimistic are you, Derek, that the president will be convicted in this trial?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic, but the fact of the matter is that the Republicans have not shown any backbone on this particular issue. We have a president that has incited a riot at our nation's capital, the People's House, and there's overwhelming evidence that that the former President Trump did this. And the Republican Party, although they say that they are shocked and incensed by what they've seen on TV and what's been presented by the House managers, they still will not convict him. There's an overwhelming amount of Republicans that will not convict Trump in this case, and it's very sad.
Mark Weaver, Rob Portman, he's not running for re-election. He likely will not face the voters again, primary voters or general election voters. What's in it for him if he votes to convict President Trump if he felt like his actions led to this riot?
I think Rob Portman will conclude that President Trump's actions did not lead to the riot any more than we blame the leaders of Black Lives Matter for the terrible protest we saw this summer, or the insurrection committed both at the federal courthouse in Portland or at the White House on May 29th. We don't blame politicians who use inflammatory language because nearly all of them do. We appropriately blame the people who broke the windows, threw the rocks, used the sticks, trespassed, and all the other evil things that were done at our legislative capital in Congress, at our judicial capital in federal courthouses, and our executive branch capital at the White House. And so I think Rob Portman knows we hold the criminals responsible. We'd have a long line of people to impeach or punish if we were holding politicians responsible for their inflammatory rhetoric.
Mark, but many of the protesters at the Capitol said they were doing what Donald Trump wanted them to do. Does that make a difference?
Yeah.
I didn't see Black Lives Matter protesters saying that Nancy Pelosi told them to protest or other things. That they were specifically saying Donald Trump wanted them to do this. And of course, many of them were carrying Trump flags.
Well, sure. Certainly the fellow who tried to assassinate Steve Scalise and shoot up the congressional baseball field was motivated by Bernie Sanders' call to healthcare, where Bernie Sanders falsely claimed that Republicans want people to die. He actually shouted the words healthcare as he was shooting at the Republicans. I think most people who heard Donald Trump did not go break the windows. Most of the people on the mall that day were protesting in the term of 2020, mostly peacefully. It's the few hundred who broke into the Capitol who were thugs and insurrectionists who need to be imprisoned, just like the few hundred people at the White House on May 29th who tried to breach the gates. It wasn't most of the people down there who did that. Most of the people at the White House on May 29th were protesting lawfully and peacefully. But the ones who tried to breach the gates need to go to prison.
Derek, you want to weigh in here?
Mike, if I could rebut that just a minute. Mark, you know that I respect you. You are a friend of mine, but that is the problem. That wasn't just a few people that went to that Capitol and just broke a few windows and kicked in a few doors. Those were thousands of Trump supporters who went in and went at the president's direction to incite a riot and mob the People's House. there's overwhelming evidence of this. People died. So
I said hundreds. There were hundreds. All of them should go to prison. There were hundreds of people attacking our federal courthouse with firebombs. Every one of them should go to prison. And they were holding signs that says Black Lives Matter. Yet we don't blame the people who support Black Lives Matter. Everyone who attacks government buildings should go to prison. The politicians who inflame them, like Bernie Sanders, like Nancy Pelosi, like Barack Obama, like Donald Trump, we hold them accountable politically at the ballot box.
We had people that were citing tweets from the president verbatim.
Oh, I believe that, and they should go to prison. And I don't know that Bernie Sanders should go to prison
to the Capitol for Stop the Steal.
Jackie Borchert.
Furthermore, there were people that were saying hang the vice president of the United States from your own party. How do you justify that?
Yeah, I don't know that they're from my party. I don't know who the woman outside the White House on Mike 29th yelling "Death to America" was, but I disagree with her. But she was with the Black Lives Matter protesters. I don't blame the politicians. I blame the criminals, and the criminals should all go to prison, whether they attack the courthouse, the White House, or Congress. Politicians have a tendency to say inflammatory things, as we've seen from Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Bernie Sanders, and of course, Donald Trump.
Jackie Borchert, let me get Jackie Borchert's take on this. Jackie Borchert, we'll talk about Josh Mandel in a moment because he launched his Senate bid this week. How are Ohio Republicans viewing this? Do they want this, conviction or acquittal to move off the stage, or are some folks hoping to use this down the road in 2022 to use against their opponent, whether they be Democrat or Republican?
Well, I think from the very political side of things, we're seeing support still for the president, or at least opposition to impeaching him this second time. Senator Rob Portman he was not among the Republicans that broke with Democrats over the motion of whether this should even continue, whether it's constitutional. He said that he has doubts that it is even constitutional to impeach a former president. So I think that's what we're hearing mostly from, is that this second impeachment trial is just totally out of line, and that if Democrats want unity, they should move forward without it, that this is dividing the country. And we've already seen in the U.S. Senate race to replace Rob Portman, certainly because there will probably be a heated primary, a lot of rhetoric pushing that further to the right, really supporting former President Trump and opposing this whole impeachment, second round of impeachment.
Yeah, we should say we are recording this on late Friday. The president's lawyers have just rested their case, so there's a chance if you're watching this on Sunday, this whole thing could have been settled by now. But anyway, we'll see how it turns out. As it turns out, some 4,000 Ohioans died of COVID last fall that we didn't know about. It's not a small error. 4,000 amounts to about a third of the state's total COVID death toll. State officials say they are still investigating what went wrong, but they blame the error on one employee who could not keep up with the surging number of death certificates that were coming in last fall. The state's director of public health says they are taking steps to restore confidence in the state's data.
I understand the concern. I'm quite confident of the new processes we have in place and the new eyes on this. And certainly this will look much different, better, and accurate going forward.
Jackie Borchert, word came late Friday that one person has resigned, another person has been reassigned in the wake of this mistake, a clerical error, they're saying this right now. What exactly happened? How did the state miss that many people?
Well, so the state of Ohio, like many other states, gets death information two ways. One, through a real-time reporting system, which is, if you go take a coronavirus test and it comes back positive, they will enter your name to this database that you tested positive. And then the next day you're in the count that we see every day that's updated on the state's website. And then the second way that they find out that someone has died is by actually reviewing the death certificates as they come into the Bureau of Vital Statistics at the Department of Health. And that process can take several months, up to 6 months, according to state law. And so in order to avoid double counting people who are coming in through both avenues, they have to compare the death certificate data with what's already been reported by physicians and local health departments and hospitals. And what we found out this week is that one person, one human, is the person who reviews those certificates and makes sure that it's not duplicated or adds that person who died to the count. So at some point in October, that was not happening 100%. We don't know at what level that wasn't happening. We don't know why it wasn't happening. We just know that, and you can kind of see looking back in the last few months, comparing our state data to the CDC data, which also receives death information through a federal vital statistics database. You can really start to see that in October, November, and especially in middle December, when we were really getting a lot of deaths coming in, being reported, that we were off by hundreds per week. And so clearly that matching that happens, those people that we were learning about through death certificates weren't being added to the state's tally that they put out publicly every day.
Now, this was coming at a time when Governor DeWine and other state officials, was during that surge, and they were considering shutting down bars and restaurants completely. They were imposing the curfew. They were considering other shutdowns of the state economy to keep people safe, but they weren't getting accurate numbers on deaths. Is there any indication that, this information would have been nice to know, regardless of what decision they made. Is there any indication their decisions would have been different last fall had they had accurate numbers?
We asked the director this earlier this week, and also Chief Medical Officer Dr. Bruce Vanderhoff, and essentially the answer is no. Deaths have been a lagging indicator, like the most lagging of all the indicators that we have throughout this pandemic, in that they fall, someone doesn't just get the coronavirus and the next day they die. Usually there's a period of sickness. Sometimes they're admitted to the hospital and then they die. So to base your policy decision making going forward on something as deaths, you're going to be looking way in the rear view mirror to see what's going on. And so what we've seen in the last, 6 months or so, is the state has really been looking at hospitalizations, as in the number of people who are currently in a hospital bed somewhere in Ohio with COVID-19. To gauge whether the spread is severe or not. Because even with cases, as we've seen, if you increase testing by 50%, you might see a similar bump in your number of cases, but you wouldn't necessarily see a bump in hospitalizations based on testing alone. So hospitalizations is one thing they're looking at, as well as test positivity. It's really a bunch of metrics, but deaths has never been the metric used to set policy going forward. But certainly looking back, when we look at that policy and we want to judge how well it worked or didn't work, deaths are probably the best metric that you can use to gauge, looking back in time, the effect of some restriction or mitigation policy.
Looking at the state's map that shows the spread across the state, it's still very red, even though we had some positive news in the past couple of weeks, but the spread is still at a very high level according to State of Ohio and CDC guidelines. Mark Weaver, when you look at that map, you look at the numbers that go behind that map, you look at this controversy over the missed deaths, how can we trust the numbers?
Well, I don't know that we'll ever know the exact numbers. First, I want to say I think Governor DeWine has done maybe the best job of any governor of managing this crisis. But here's one thing to know about pandemics is we'll never get the exact numbers. Absent autopsies, we don't know that some of these elderly folks died with COVID or of COVID, died of COVID. Some of them died with COVID. And in this case, we may have counts because of this human error. What I think is interesting is here our Auditor of State, Keith Faber, suggested that his office would look into the data to make sure the correct data is being put forward. I think what happened this week shows that that was a good idea. Having said that, I don't know that any state will ever get the exact numbers. We ought to get the best numbers we can possibly get so our policymakers can make good decisions.
Derek Clay, this news came as New York is facing a controversy in that apparently there were nursing home deaths that weren't accounted with the state's nursing home, with the overall death count because the person died in the hospital, even though they caught it in a nursing home. Does that raise, given that context, that has to raise a red flag about these numbers?
Well, of course, and it's very unfortunate that these deaths weren't accounted for. 4,000, that's a lot of people to not be accounted for. And the bottom line is it goes back to trust and how the public feels about, this administration, the DeWine administration's ability to give accurate information. Now, I agree to a certain point that the governor has done a very fine job in terms of making sure that the public is aware of what's going on, trying to give the best possible information possible. But this is a major blunder and one that should not have happened. And hopefully, his administration can take the necessary steps to correct it in the future.
All right, we have an official candidate for U.S. Senate to fill the seat being vacated by Rob Portman. Josh Mandel hopes the third time is a charm. The former state treasurer has run for the Senate twice before. Never shy about taking controversial stands, Mandel is all in when it comes to President Trump.
I'm not going to Washington to make friends with politicians. I'm going to Washington to take on the system, whether that means taking on Republican leaders, Democrat leaders, I don't care. I'll take them all on when it means standing up for the Constitution, standing up for individual liberty, and standing up for the Trump America First agenda. It might be months, it might be years, it might be decades, but I think when we look back on this election, we'll see in large part that it was stolen from President Trump.
Of course, there's no evidence of widespread fraud, and President Trump lost the election fair and square. Mandel will not be the only Republican running. Former GOP chair of Ohio, Jane Timken, is expected to run, and several other Republicans are considering a run as well. Mark Weaver, you work with two congressmen who are considering possibly running for U.S. Senate. That Josh Mandel message, is that what it's going to take to win the Ohio primary, or is it too strong, and could it come back to bite him in a general should he survive the primary?
Well, that is the great challenge, right? Because remember, the greatest test of public opinion that we can rely on was November, and we're about a 50-50 country, red and blue. Ohio, of course, is about a +8 Republican state. And so I think that Republicans still want to see candidates who will fight for the Trump agenda. Whether or not they want to fight for everything Trump says, I don't think that's true. And so Josh Mandel recognizes that, as does Jane Timken and Bill Johnson, Brad Wenstrup, these other people who are looking at this race. And so the electorate, the primary electorate, wants to see somebody who will fight some of the fights that Donald Trump took on as president without some of the mistakes he made that allowed the Democrats to take advantage. So I think Josh Mandel may have the right message, but you'll hear that same message from a lot of folks like Jane Timken, like Bill Johnson, like others.
Mark, you're a communications professional, give a lot of advice to folks. He's making these statements as Americans are watching the insurrection at the Capitol. Whether you think Donald Trump was responsible or not, they're all carrying Trump signs. The election was not stolen. He's claiming it was stolen. Was that intentional? Was that a mistake? I mean, it just seems like a very odd juxtaposition if you had a split screen watching Josh Mandel and then people storming the Capitol.
Yeah, I know, Josh. I didn't talk to him about those comments. We're kind of in a flipped coin from where we were 4 years ago, when a majority of Democrats thought that Donald Trump won the election because of collusion with the Russians or rigging. And of course, we know now that's not true. Of course, that's been shown not to be true by the Mueller report. And so 4 years ago, Democrats had a false belief about how the election was won. And 4 years later, a lot of Republicans have a false belief about the election being stolen. We all agree there were problems and irregularities that ought to be cleaned up, but Joe Biden won. But Republicans are as angry about the Trump loss as Democrats were as angry about the Hillary Clinton loss 4 years ago.
Of course, the difference is Hillary Clinton supporters didn't storm the Capitol, and there was I don't think it was a majority of Democrats that it was stolen. But Derek Clay, do you want to take on someone like Josh Mandel? Donald Trump won this state by 8 points. His message worked in 2020. Will it still work in 2022?
Absolutely. Well, Josh Mandel needs to first determine whether he's a Democrat or Republican. I mean, he worked for me when I was the state director of the Gore campaign as an intern. So he needs to figure out what his political allegiances are. But what I will say is that, this race, this U.S. Senate race is going to be an uphill battle for Democrats, but it's not going to be one that we can't win. This is an open seat. Senator Portman has a lot of support in the state. And of course, if he lends his support to one of the GOP candidates, that's going to give them a leg up. But you got to look at our bench as well. I mean, when you look at Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, you look at someone like a Kevin Boyce, who's a Franklin County commissioner, president of the Franklin County Commission, who was a statewide office holder in the state. and you look at someone like a minority leader, Amelia Sykes. I mean, these are all elected officials in their own right that have done very well, that have a lot of statewide electoral potential.
Yep. You didn't mention Amy Acton. How credible do you, how big a challenge does she face to other Democrats around the state?
Well, you know, Amy Acton is a newcomer to politics, former health director. Running for U.S. Senate and being the health director for the state are two different things. You know, this is going to be a $30 to $50 million race, and if you're not committed to raising those dollars, and if you don't raise those dollars early on and show people that you have the ability to raise the money and put together the necessary organization, then you're not going to be successful.
All right. With all that's going on, it's easy to forget the State House continues to deal with a $61 million bribery scandal. The latest developments: the so-called dark money group at the center of the probe has agreed to plead guilty. The chief federal prosecutor in the case is resigning. The leader of the alleged scheme, State Rep and former House Speaker Larry Householder, remains in office, but now a group of public officials from his district are asking him to leave the legislature. And now there is new speculation that the company that got the nuclear bailout in the first place may turn it down. Jackie Borchert, I'm not quite sure where to begin here, but David DeVillers is resigning. He was appointed by Donald Trump. It's not surprising the U.S. attorney would resign with a change in administrations. Where does that leave the case if he leaves, when he leaves?
I think you broke it down pretty well, all the various different angles of the story that are still in motion. As far as Attorney DeVillers stepping down, it is customary that when a new presidential administration comes in, the DOJ replaces the U.S. attorneys, but that doesn't mean that there aren't political objections to those replacements. And even this time around, I think your viewers probably remember 4 years ago, there were some pretty strong, Democrats had some pretty strong objections to a few of the U.S. attorneys that were, given the boot or asked to resign. And this time around, we saw, not necessarily in Ohio, but I know in Illinois, there was some pushback because they have public corruption scandals that are being worked on there. And so it's like a very small number being asked to stay on. And I think some people in Ohio were hoping that Dave DeVillers would be among those. But, DeVillers is a pro, and he's assured everybody that all the investigations in his office and the public corruption ones are kind of what everyone is really familiar with right now, including in addition to the House Bill 6 householder case. There's also several Cincinnati City Council cases that are still pending and going through. A lot of these, that's kind of, I think, what he will be most probably well known for after leaving office. But those investigations began before he entered office, and he's confident that the rest of the staff, the very experienced staff at the Southern District of Ohio, will be able to continue forward with those and finish them up.
Mark Weaver, you've worked in the Attorney General's office in the course of your career. Is it pretty seamless going from one U.S. attorney to another with a change of administrations, with active investigations?
Not always. Some of your viewers may know that I wrote an op-ed a few weeks ago in the Dispatch urging Joe Biden to keep David DeVillers at least on for the first few years. Recall that the Trump Justice Department allowed the Obama U.S. attorney in Ohio to remain on for 2 years. They did not have to do that. So it is done in certain cases. And I think Joe Biden would have made the right decision. He would have sent a good message of good government had he allowed Dave DeVillers to stay on at least until the House Bill 6 investigation is done. I think it was a mistake for Biden to have done that. And Sherrod Brown either didn't advise Biden to do that or agreed with him that DeVillers should go. And I think it's a shame. DeVillers has been a hero in this case.
Derek Clay, what do you think happens in this investigation? What do you think happens to the House Bill 6, the bailout? Does it go away? Does Energy Harbor say, you know what, we don't need the money, and lawmakers are off the hook?
No, it's definitely not going away. As a matter of fact, there are several bills in the Ohio legislature now that are looking to repeal House Bill 6 and to, make whole the Ohio taxpayer. So this is definitely not going away. This week there were, 20 some odd people that wrote letters to remove Larry Householder from the Ohio legislature. He was not given any committee assignments. So I think that the GOP is slowly taking the steps to remove him from office.
All right, let's get to our off-the-record parting shots. Mark Weaver, you're up first.
What I'm hearing is that Mayor Ginther may be in some political trouble here in Columbus. The police chief was forced to be demoted to another office, largely because people thought his leadership, at least some people thought his leadership was not strong in some of the wake of some of these police shootings. What I'm hearing is that Mayor Ginther may see more political competition than he has in the past, and people may come asking for him to be held accountable for some of the problems Columbus is currently facing.
Derek Clay, your final thought.
We had news this week that the census data is not going to be released until September, but redistricting is upon us. There are several things that the legislature can do, including, releasing funds to both the Democrat and Republican caucuses. The governor can reconvene the redistricting task force, and the legislature can pass a public submission bill that's required by law. So lots of moving parts going on with redistricting.
And Jackie Borchert.
Well, Derek took mine, so I'll just point out that the Ohio Department of Health has now allowed self-serve buffet lines and salad bars to reopen, and if that's your thing. But Dan Rather, the famed journalist, tweeted out that he's going to take a hard pass on that.
Yeah, maybe the buffet and the salad bar will be one long-lasting casualty of the pandemic. Wouldn't that be perhaps nice? I don't know. I'm not a big fan either. That's Columbus on the Record for this week. Check us out online, WOSU.org. For our crew and for our panel, I'm Mike Thompson. Have a good week.